Well, good evening, everyone. So glad you're here. Well, looks like we got some out-of-towners here. Somebody brought some friends for this fire. It's going to be a big one. Throw some more wood on there. Get yourself something in your mug, and let's find a place to sit down or stand around and listen to some stories. Well, I got a little more of that Max brand I want to read you, The Untamed. It's a great story. It's getting better. They're chasing them down, and things are getting interesting. So I'm going to start you right in here with chapter 18. And this is going by the name of Cain. Well, hardly a score of miles away, Jim Silent and his 6 companions topped a hill. He raised his hand, and the others drew rein beside him. Kate Cumberland shifted her weight a little to one side of the saddle to rest and looked down from the crest on the sweep of country below. A mile away, the railroad made a streak of silver light across the brown range, and directly before them stood the squat station house with red-tiled roof. Just before the house, a slightly broader streak of that gleaming light showed the position of the siding rails. As she turned her head towards the outlaws, they were listening to the final directions of their chief, and the darkly intent faces told their own story. She knew, from what she had gathered of their casual hints, that this was to be the scene of the train holdup. It seemed impossible that this little group of men could hold the great fabric of a train with all of its scores of passengers at their mercy. In spite of herself, half her heart wished them success. There was Terry Jordan, forgetful of the wound in his arm, Shorty Reinhardt, his saturnine face longer and more calamitous than ever, Hal Purvis, grinning and nodding his head, Bill Kilduff with his heavy jaw set like a bulldog's, and Lee Haines with a lock of tawny hair blowing over his forehead, smiling faintly as he listened to Silent, as if he heard a girl tell a story of love. And finally, Jim Silent himself, huge, solemn, confident. She began to feel that these 6 men were worth 600. She hated them for some reasons. She feared them for others. But the brave blood of Joe Cumberland was thick in her, and she loved the danger of the coming moment. Their plans were finally agreed upon, their masks arranged, and after Haines had tied a similar visor over Kate's face, they started down the hill at a swinging gallop. In front of the house of the station agent, they drew up, and while the others were at their horses, Lee Haines dismounted and rapped loudly at the door. It was opened by a gray-bearded man smoking a pipe. Haines covered him. He tossed up his hands, and the pipe dropped from his mouth. "Who's in the house here with you?" asked Haines. "Not a soul," stammered the man. "If you're looking for money, you can go through the house. You won't find a thing worth the taking." "I don't want money, I want you," said Haines, and immediately explained. "You're perfectly safe. All you have to do is to be obliging. As for the money, you just throw open that switch and flag the train when she rolls along in a few moments. We'll take care of the rest. You don't have to keep your hands up." The hands came down slowly. For a brief instant, the agent surveyed Haines and the group of masked men who sat their horses a few paces away. Then, without a word, he picked up his flag from behind the door and walked out of the house. Throughout the affair, he never uttered a syllable. Haines walked up to the head of the siding with him while he opened the switch, and accompanied him back to the point opposite the station house to see that he gave the stop signal correctly. In the meantime, 2 of the other outlaws entered that little station, bound the telegrapher hand and foot, shattered his instrument. That would prevent the sending of any call for help after the holdup. Purvis and Jordan, since Terry could shoot with his left hand in case of need, went to the other side of the track and lay down against the grade. Now it was their business to open fire at the tops of the windows as the train drew to a stop. That would keep the passengers inside. Now the other 4 were distributed along the side nearest the station house. Shorty Reinhardt and Bill Kilduff were to see that no passengers broke out from the train and attempted a flank attack. Haines would attend to having the firebox of the engine flooded. For the cracking of the safe, Silent carried the stick of dynamite. Now the long wait began. There is a dreamlike quality about bright mornings in the open country, and everything seemed unreal to Kate. It was impossible that tragedy should come on such a day. The moments stole on. She saw Silent glance twice at his watch and scowl. Evidently the train was late, and possibly they would give up the attempt. Then a light humming caught her ear. She held her breath and listened again. It was unmistakable. A slight thing. Just a tremor to be felt rather than heard, as she saw Haynes peering under shaded eyes far down the track. And following the direction of his gaze, she saw a tiny spot of haze on the horizon. The tiny puff of smoke developed to a deeper, louder note. A station agent took his place on the track. Now the train bulked big, the engine wavering slightly to the unevenness of the roadbed. The flag of the station agent moved. Kate closed her eyes and set her teeth. There was a rumbling and a puffing and a mighty grinding, a shout somewhere, the rattle of a score of pistol shots. She opened her eyes to see the train rolling to a stop on the siding directly before her. Kilduff and Shorty Reinhardt, crouching against the grade, were splintering the windows one by one with nicely placed shots. The baggage cars were farther up the siding than Silent calculated, and he and Haynes now ran towards the head of the train. The fireman and the engineer jumped from the cab, holding their arms stiffly above their heads, and Haynes approached with poised revolver to make them flood the firebox. In this way, the train would be delayed for some time, and before it could send out the alarm, the bandits would be far from pursuit. Haynes had already reached the locomotive, and Silent was running towards the first baggage car, when the door of that car slid open, and at the entrance appeared two men with rifles at their shoulders. As they opened fire, Silent pitched to the ground. Kate set her teeth and forced her eyes to stay open. Even as the outlaw fell, his revolver spoke, and one of the men threw up his hands with a yell and pitched out of the open door. His companion still kept his post, pumping shots at the prone figure. Twice more the muzzle of Silent's gun jerked up, and the second man crumpled on the floor of the car. A great hissing and jetting cloud of steam announced that Haynes had succeeded in flooding the firebox. Silent climbed into the first baggage car, stepping, as he did so, on the limp body of the Wells Fargo agent who lay on the roadbed. A moment later, he flung out the body of the second messenger. The man plopped on the ground heavily, face downwards, and then, greatest horror of all, dragged himself to his hands and knees and began to crawl laboriously. Kate ran and dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you hurt badly?" she pleaded. Where? He sagged to the ground and lay on his left side, breathing heavily. "Where is the wound?" she repeated. Well, he attempted to speak, but only a bloody froth came to his lips. That was sufficient to tell her that he'd been shot through the lungs. She tore open his shirt and found two purple spots high on the chest, one to the right, one to the left. From that on the left ran a tiny trickle of blood, but that on the right was only a small puncture in the midst of a bruise. He was far past all help. "Speak to me," she pleaded. His eyes rolled and then checked on her face. "Done for," he said in a horrible whisper. "That devil done me, kid. Cut out. This life. I played this game. Myself, and now I'm going to hell for it." A great convulsion twisted his face. "What can I do?" cried Kate. "Tell the world I died game." His body writhed, and in the last agony his hand closed hard over hers. It was just like a silent farewell, that strong clasp. A great hand caught her by the shoulder and jerked her to her feet. "The charge is going off. Jump for it," shouted Silent in her ear. She sprang up, and at the same time there was a great boom from within the car. The side bulged out. A section of the top lifted and fell back with a crash, and Silent ran back into the smoke. Haynes, Purvis, and Kilduff were instantly at the car, taking the ponderous little canvas sacks of coins as their chief handed them out. Within 2 minutes after the explosion, 10 small sacks were deposited in the saddlebags on the horses which stood before the station house. Silent's whistle called in Terry Jordan and Shorty Reinhardt. A sharp order forced Kate to climb into her saddle, and the train robbers struck up the hillside at a racing pace. A confused shouting rose behind them. Rifles commenced to crack where some of the passengers had taken up the weapons of the dead guards. But the bullets flew wide, and the little troop was soon safely out of range. On the other side of the hilltop, they changed their course to the right. For half an hour, the killing pace continued, and then, as there was not a sign of immediate chase, the lone riders drew down to a soberer pace. Silent called out, "Keep bunched behind me. We're headed for old Sultan's place and a long rest." Well, Chapter 19, Real Men. Some people pointed out that Sheriff Gus Morris had never made a single important arrest in the 10 years during which he had held office, and there was a few slanderers who spoke insinuatingly of the manner in which the lone riders flourished in Morris's domain. These knockers, however, were voted down by the vast majority, who swore that the sheriff was the finest fellow who ever threw a leg over saddle. See, they liked him for his inexhaustible good nature, the mellow baritone in which he sang the range's songs at anyone's request, and perhaps more than all for the very laxness with which he conducted his work. They'd had enough of the old school of sheriffs who lived a few months gun in hand and died fighting from the saddle. The office had never seemed desirable until Gus Morris ran for it and smiled his way to a triumphant election. Before his career as an office holder began, he ran a combined general merchandise store, saloon, hotel. That is to say, he ran the hostelry in name. The real executive head, general, manager, clerk, bookkeeper, and cook. Sometimes even bartender was his daughter Jacqueline. She found the place only a saloon, and a poorly patronized one at that. Her unaided energy gradually made it into a hotel, a restaurant, and a store. Even while her father was in office, he spent most of his time around the hotel. But no matter how important he might be elsewhere, in his own house he had no voice. There the only law was the will of Jacqueline. Out of the stable behind this hostelry, Dan and Tex Calder walked on the evening of the train robbery. They had reached the place of the holdup a full 2 hours after Silent's crews departed, and the fireman and the engineer had been working frantically during the interim to clean out the soaked firebox and to get steam up again. Tex looked at the 2 dead bodies, spoke to the conductor, and then cut short the voluble explanations of a score of passengers by turning his horse and riding away, followed by Dan. All that day he was gloomily silent. It was a shrewd blow at his reputation, for the outlaws had actually carried out the robbery while he was on their trail. Not till they came out of the horse shed after stabling their horses did he speak freely. "Dan," he said, "do you know anything about Sheriff Gus Morris?" "No." "Then listen to this and salt every word away. Now, I'm an officer of the law, but I won't tell that to Morris. I hope he doesn't know me. If he does, it will spoil our game. I am almost certain he is playing a close hand with the lone riders. I'll wager he'd rather see a stick of dynamite than a marshal. Remember when we get in that place that we're not after Jim Silent or anyone else. We're simply traveling cowboys. No questions. I expect to learn something about the location of Silent's gang while we're here. But we'll never find out except by hints and chance remarks. We have to watch Morris like hawks. If he suspects us, he'll find a way to let Silent know we're here, and then the hunters will be hunted." In the house, they found a dozen cattlemen sitting down at the tables in the dining room. As they entered the room, the sheriff, who sat at the head of one of the tables, waved his hand to them. "How are ye, boys?" he called. "You'll find a couple of chairs right in the next room. Got 2 extra plates, Jack?" As Dan followed Tex after the chairs, he noticed the sheriff beckon to one of his men who sat near him. As they returned with the chairs, someone was leaving the room by another door. "Tex," he said as they sat down side by side, "when we left the dining room for the chairs, the sheriff spoke to one of his boys, and as we came back, one of them was leaving through another door. Do you think Morris knew you when you come in?" Calder frowned thoughtfully, then shook his head. "No," he said in a low voice. "I watched him like a hawk when we entered. He didn't bat an eye when he saw me. If he recognized me, he's the greatest actor in the world, bar none. No, Dan, he doesn't know us from Adam and Abel." "All right," said Dan, "but I don't like something about this place. Maybe it's the smell of the air. Tex, take my advice and keep your gun ready for the fastest draw you ever made." "Don't worry about me," smiled Calder. "How's about yourself?" "Well, hello," broke in Jacqueline from the end of the table. "Look who we've picked up in the draw." Her voice was musical, but her accent and her manner were those of a girl who's lived all her life among men and has caught their ways, with an exaggeration of that self-confidence which a woman always feels among Western men. Her blue eyes were upon Dan. "Ain't you a long ways from home?" she went on. The rest of the table, perceiving the drift of her badgering, broke into a rumbling bass chuckle. "Quite a ways," said Dan, and his wide brown eyes looked seriously back at her. A yell of delight came from the men at this naive rejoinder. Dan looked about him with a sort of a childish wonder. Calder's anxious whisper came at his side. "Don't let them get you mad, Dan." Jacqueline, having scored so heavily with her first shot, was by no means willing to give up her sport. "With them big eyes for a starter," she said, "all you need's long hair to be perfect. Do your folks generally let you run around like this?" Well, every man canted his ear to get the answer, and already they was grinning expectantly. "I don't go out much," returned the soft voice of Dan. "And when I do, I go with my friend here. He takes care of me." Another thunder of laughter broke out. Jacqueline had apparently uncovered a tenderfoot, and a rare one even for that absurd species. A sandy-haired cattle puncher who sat close to Jacqueline now took the cue from the mistress of the house. "Ain't you a bit scared when you get around real men?" he asked, leering up the table towards Dan. The latter smiled gently upon him. "I reckon maybe I am," he said amiably. "Then you must be shaking in your boots right now," said the others over the sound of the laughter. "No," said Dan, "I feel sort of comfortable." The other replied with a frown that would have intimidated a balky horse. "What you mean? And you just said men made you sort of nervous." He imitated the soft drawl of Dan with his last words and raised another yell of delight from the crowd. Whistlin Dan turned his gentle eyes upon Jacqueline. "Pardon me, ma'am," he began. An instant hush fell on the men. They would not miss one syllable of the delightful remarks of this rarest of all tenderfoots, and the prelude of this coming utterance promised something that would eclipse all that had gone before. "Well, talk right out, Brown Eyes," said Jacqueline, wiping the tears of delight from her eyes. "Talk right out as if you was a man. I won't hurt you." "Well, I just wanted to ask," said Dan, "if these are real men." The ready laughter started, checked, and died suddenly away. The cattlemen looked at each other in puzzled surprise. "Don't they look like it to you, honey?" asked Jacqueline curiously. Dan allowed his eyes to pass lingeringly around the table from face to face. "I don't know," he said at last. They look sort of queer to me." "For God's sake, cut this short, Dan," pleaded Tex Calder in an undertone. "Let them have all the rope they want. Don't trip up our party before we get started." "Queer?" echoed Jacqueline, and then there was a deep murmur from the men. "Sure," said Dan, smiling upon her again. "They all wearing their guns so awful high." Out of the dead silence broke the roar of the sandy-haired man. "What in hell do you mean by that?" Dan leaned forward on one elbow, his right hand free and resting on the edge of the table, but still his smile was almost a caress. "Why," he said, "maybe you can explain to me. Seems to me that all these guns is wore so high that they's more for ornament than use." "You damn pup," began Sandy. He stopped short and stared with peculiar fascination at Dan, who started to speak again. His voice had changed, not greatly, for its pitch was the same and the drawl was the same, but there was a purr in it that made every man stiffen in his chair and make sure that his right hand was free. The ghost of his former smile was still on his lips, but it was his eyes that seemed to fascinate Sandy. "Maybe I'm wrong, partner," he was saying, "and maybe you can prove that your gun ain't just ornamental hardware." What followed was very strange. Now, Sandy was a brave man, and everyone at that table knew it. They waited for the inevitable to happen. They waited for Sandy's lightning move for his gun. They waited for the flash and the crack of the revolver. It did not come. There followed a still more stunning wonder. "You can see," went on that caressing voice of Dan, "that everyone is waiting for you to demonstrate, which the lady is most special interested." And still Sandy did not move that significant right hand. It remained fixed in the air, a few inches above the table, the fingers stiffly spread. He moistened his white lips. Then, most strange of all, his eyes shifted and wandered away from the face of Whistlin Dan. The others exchanged incredulous glances. The impossible had happened. Sandy had taken water. The sheriff was first to recover, though his forehead was shining with perspiration. "What's all this stuff about?" he called. "Hey, Sandy, quit picking trouble with the stranger." Sandy seized the loophole through which to escape with his honor. He settled back in his chair. "All right, Governor," he said. "I won't go spoiling your furniture. I won't hurt him." Well, let's go to chapter 20. One trail ends. But this deceived no one. They had seen him palpably take water. A moment of silence followed while Sandy stared white-faced down at the table, avoiding all the eyes, but all the elements of good breeding exist under all the roughness of the West. It was Jacqueline, who began with a joke, which was rather old, but everyone appreciated it at the moment. The laughter lasted long enough to restore some of the color to Sandy's face. A general rapid fire of talk followed. "How'd you do that?" queried Calder. "I was all prepared for gunplay." "Why, you seen I didn't do nothing." "Then what in the world made Sandy freeze while his hand was on his way to his gun?" "I don't know," sighed Dan, "but when I seen his hand start moving, I sort of wanted his blood. I wanted him to keep right on till he got a hold of his gun, and maybe he seen that in my eyes, and that sort of changed his mind." "I haven't the least doubt that it did," said Calder grimly. At the foot of the table, Jacqueline's right-hand neighbor was saying, "What happened, Jack?" "Don't ask me," she replied. "All I know is that I don't think any less of Sandy 'cause he backed down. I saw that stranger's face myself, and I still sort of weak inside." "How did he look?" "I don't know, just hungry, understand?" She was silent for a time, but she was evidently thinking hard. At last she turned to the same man. "Did you hear Brown Eyes say that the broad-shouldered feller next to him was his friend?" "Sure, I seen 'em ride in together. The other one looked like a hard nut, huh?" She returned no answer, but after a time her eyes raised slowly and rested for a long moment on Dan's face. It was toward the end of the meal, and when she rose and went toward the kitchen, at the door she turned, and Dan, though he was looking down at his plate, was conscious that someone was observing him. He glanced up, and the moment his eyes met hers, she made a significant backward gesture with her hand. He hesitated a moment, and then shoved back his chair. Calder was busy talking to a table mate, so he walked out of the house without speaking to his companion. He went to the rear of the house, and as he had expected, she was awaiting for him. "Brown Eyes," she said swiftly, "that feller who sat beside you, is he your partner?" "I don't know," said Dan evasively. "Why you asking?" Her breath was coming audibly as if from excitement. "Have you got a fast hoss?" "There ain't no faster. Believe me, he can't go none too fast with you tonight. Maybe they're after you too." "Who?" "I can't tell you. Listen to me, Brown Eyes. Go get your hoss and feed him the spur till you're 100 miles away, and even then don't stop running." He merely stared at her curiously. "Don't stop to talk. If they're after him and you're his partner, they probably want you too." "I'll stay around. If they're curious about me, I'll tell them my name, and I'll even spell it for them. Who are they?" "They are hell, that's all." "Well, I'd like to see them. Maybe they're real men." "They're devils. If I told you their names, you'll turn stiff." "I'll take one chance. Tell me who they are." "I don't dare tell you." She hesitated. "I will tell you. You've made a fool out of me with them big baby eyes. Jim Silent is in that house." He turned and ran, but not for the horse shed. He headed straight for the open door of the house. In the dining room, 2 more had left the table, but the rest, lingering over their fresh-filled coffee cups, sat around telling tales, and Tex Calder was among them. He was about to push back his chair when the hum of talk ceased as if at a command. The men on the opposite side of the table were staring with fascinating eyes at the door. And then a big voice boomed behind him. "Tex Calder, stand up. You've come to the end of the trail." He whirled as he rose, kicking down the chair behind him, and stood face to face with Jim Silent. The great outlaw was scowling, but his gun was in its holster and his hands rested lightly on his hips. It was plain for all eyes to see that he had come not to murder, but to fight a fair duel. Behind him loomed the figure of Lee Haines, scarcely less imposing. All eternity seemed poised and waiting for the second when one of the men would make the move for his gun. Not a breath was drawn in the room. Hands remained frozen in the air for the midst of a gesture. Lips which had parted to speak did not close. The steady voice of the clock broke into the silence. A dying space between every tick. For the second time in his life, Tex Calder knew fear. He saw no mere man before him but his own destiny, and he knew that if he stood before those glaring eyes another minute, he would become like poor Sandy a few minutes before, a white-faced, palsied coward. The shame of the thought gave him power. "Silent," he said, "there's a quick end to the longest trail, because—" His hand darted down. No eye could follow the lightning speed with which he whipped out his revolver and fanned it. But by a mortal fraction of a second, the convulsive jerk of Silent's hand was faster still. 2 shots followed, and they were rather like one drawn-out report. The woodwork splintered above the outlaw's head. Tex Calder seemed to laugh, but his lips made no sound. He pitched forward on his face. "He fired that bullet," said Silent, "after mine hit him." Then he leaped back through the door. "Keep 'em back 1 minute, Lee, and then after me," he said as he ran. Haines stood in the door with folded arms. He knew that no one would dare to move a hand. 2 doors slammed at the same moment. The front door as Silent leaped into the safety of the night, and the rear door as Whistlin Dan rushed into the house. He stood at the entrance from the kitchen to the dining room, half crouched, and swaying from the suddenness with which he had checked his run. He saw the sprawled form of Tex Calder on the floor, and the erect figure of Lee Haines just opposite him. "For God's sake," screamed Gus Morris, "don't shoot, Haines. He done nothing. Let him go." "My life or his," said Haines savagely. "He's not a man, he's a devil." Dan was laughing low, a sound like a croon. "Tex," he said, "I'm going to take him alive for you." As if in answer, the dying man stirred on the floor. Haines went for his gun, a movement almost as lightning swift as that of Jim Silent, but now far too late. The revolver was hardly clear of its holster when Whistlin Dan's weapon spoke. Haines, with a curse, clapped his left hand over his wounded right forearm, and then reached after his weapon as it clattered to the floor. Once more he was too late. Dan tossed his gun away with a snarl like the growl of a wolf, cleared the table at a leap, and was at Haines' throat. The bandit fought back desperately, vainly. One instant they struggled erect, swaying. The next, Haines was lifted bodily and hurled to the floor. He writhed around, but under those prisoning hands he was helpless. The sheriff headed the rush for the scene of the struggle, but Dan stopped him. "All you can do," he said, "is to bring me a piece of rope." Jacqueline came running with a stout piece of twine with which he twisted around the wrists of Haines. Then he jerked the outlaw to his feet and stood close, his face inhumanly pale. "If he dies," he said, pointing with a stiff arm back at the prostrate figure of Tex Calder, you'll burn alive for it." The sheriff and 2 of the other men turned the body of Calder on his back. They tore open his shirt, and Jacqueline leaned over him with a basin of water, trying to wipe away the ever-recurrent blood which was trickling down his breast. Dan brushed them away and caught the head of his companion in his arms. "Tex," he moaned, "Tex, open your eyes, partner. I got him for you. I got him alive for you to look at him. Wake up." As if in obedience to the summons, the eyes of Calder opened wide. The lids fluttered as if to clear his vision, but even then his gaze was filmed with a telltale shadow. "Dan, Whistlin Dan," he said, "I'm seeing you a long, long ways off. Partner, I'm done for." The whole body of Dan stiffened. Done? Tex, you can't be. 5 minutes ago you sat at that there table smiling and talking. It doesn't take 5 minutes. Half a second can take a man all the way to hell. If you're going, pal, if you going, Tex, take one comfort with you. I got the man who killed you. Come here. He pulled the outlaw to his knees beside the dying marshal, whose face had lighted wonderfully. He strained his eyes painfully to make out the face of his slayer. Then he turned his head. He said the man who killed me was Jim Silent. Dan groaned and leaned close to Calder. Then I'll follow him to the end, he began. The feeble accent of Calder interrupted him. Not that way. Come close to me. I can't hear my own voice hardly. Dan bowed his head. A whisper murmured on for a moment, broken here and there as Dan nodded his head and said yes. Then hold up your hand, your right hand, said Calder at last audibly. Dan obeyed. You swear it? So help me God. Then here's the pledge of it. Calder fumbled inside his shirt for a moment and then withdrew his hand, placing palm down in that of Dan. The breath of the marshal was coming in a rattling gasp. I've stopped the trails of 20 men. It took the greatest of them all to get me. He got me fair. He beat me to the draw. He stopped as if in awe. He played square. He's a better man than I, Dan. When you get him, do it the same way. Face to face. With time for him to think of hell before he gets there, partner. I'm going. Wish me luck. Tex, partner, good luck. It seemed as if that parting wish was granted, for Calder died with a smile. When Dan rose slowly, Gus Morris stepped up and laid a hand on his arm. Look here, there ain't no use of being sad for Tex Calder. His business was killing men, and his own time was overdue. Dan turned a face that made Morris wince. What's the matter, he asked, with an attempt at bluff good nature. Do you hate everyone because one man is dead? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll loan you a buckboard and a pair of hosses to take Tex back to Elkhead. As for this feller Haynes, I'll take care of him. I sure need a buckboard, said Dan slowly. He turned his back sharply on the sheriff and asked if anyone else had a wagon that they could lend him. One of the men had stopped at Morris's place on his way to Elkhead. He immediately proposed that they make the trip together. All right, said Morris carelessly. I won't pick trouble with a crazy man. Come with me, Haynes. He turned to leave the room. Wait, said Dan. Haynes stopped as though someone had seized him by the shoulders. What the devil is this now? Asked Morris furiously. Stranger, do you think you can run the world? Come on with me, Haynes. He stays with me, said Dan. By God, began Morris, if I thought... This ain't no place for you to begin thinking, said the man who had offered his buckboard to Dan. This feller made the capture, and he's got the right to take him to Elkhead if he wants. There's a reward on the head of Lee Haynes. The arrest is made in my county, said Morris stoutly, and I've got to say as to what's to be done with the prisoner. Morris, said Haynes earnestly, if I'm taken to Elkhead, it'll be simply a matter of lynching. You know the crowd in that town. Right, said Morris, eagerly picking up the word. It'd be plain lynching. Murder. Dan broke in. Haynes, step over here behind me. For one instant, Haynes hesitated and then obeyed silently. This is contempt of the law and officer of the law, said Morris. And I'll see that you get fined so that... Better cut it short, Sheriff, said one of the men. I wouldn't go calling the attention of folks to the way Jim Silent walked into your own house and made his getaway without you trying to raise a hand. Law or no law, I'm with this stranger. Me too, said another. Any man who can fan a gun like him don't need no law. The sheriff saw that the tide of opinion had set strongly against him and abandoned his position with speed, if not with grace. Dan ordered Haynes to walk before him outside the house. They faced each other in the dim moonlight. I've got one question to ask you, he said. Make it short, said Haynes calmly. I've got to do my talking before the lynching crowd. You can answer it in one word. Does Kate Cumberland... What is she to you? Lee Haynes set his teeth. All the world, he said. Even in the dim light he saw the yellow glow of Dan's eyes, and he felt as if a wolf stood there trembling with eagerness to leap at his throat. And what are you to her? No more than the dirt under her feet. Haynes, you lie. I tell you, if that she cared for me as much as she does for the horse she rides on, I'd let the whole world know if I had to die for it the next moment. Truth has a ring of its own. Haynes, if I could hear that from her own lips, I'd let you go free. If you'll show me the way to Kate, I'll set you loose the minute I see her. I can't do it. I've given my faith to Silent and his men. Where she is, they are. Haynes, that means death for you. I know it. Another plan had come to Dan as they talked. He took Haynes inside again, and coming out once more, whistled for Bart. The wolf appeared as if by magic through the dark. He took out Kate's glove, which the wolf had brought to him in the willows, and allowed him to smell it. Bart whined eagerly. If he had that glove, he would range the hills until he found its owner, directed to her by that strange instinct of the wild things. If Kate still loved him, that glove would be more eloquent than 1,000 messages. And if she managed to escape, the wolf would guide her back to his master. He sat on his heels, caught the wolf on either side of the shaggy head, stared into that glow of the yellow-green eyes. That was as if the man was speaking to the wolf. At last, as if satisfied, he drew a deep breath. He rose and he dropped the glove. It was caught in the flashing teeth. For another moment, Bart stood whining and staring up to the face of his master. Then he whirled and fled out into the night. Well, that was a heck of a story now. A nice continuation of the Untamed we're working on. And, well, that'll do us for a while. And we'll see you next week here. Tell some more stories and enjoy some company. And I'll tell you some more of this story about the Untamed. We got a few more chapters to go, and it's getting interesting. I think he's going to find his... I think he's going to find what he's looking for. Anyway, have the rest of the good evening, and I'll see y'all next week. This is Clay Steele. Good night.